Welcome back. Let's now try out Flexbox for the very first time in practice. And for now we're going to use CodePen again, because what we want right now is just to write a simple demo, so a simple example. And for that, CodePen is perfect. So just head over to codepen.io and then click here, create a new pen. Okay, so we can hide this JavaScript part here, and then just HTML and CSS. So here in the HTML, let's just create a container with a couple of items in it. And we can actually use the emmet syntax here that I showed you before. So an element called container, and then with items in there. So class item, and then 5 times, hit tab, and that's it. And I'm just gonna put some numbers here, like 1, 2, 3, 4, and 5. And that should be enough for our demo. Now, before writing any actual Flexbox code, let's start by doing our global reset like we usually do. So margin 0, padding 0, and box sizing border box. Okay, now we can hit save here as well. And no, we don't need an account, so let's remove that as well. Okay, and now just some very quick formatting for the container and for the items. So just a quick background color, like this gray color, and give it some padding as well of like 10 pixels. Okay, so no Flexbox code here at all, just some initial styling before we start with Flexbox. Now about the items, let's give them some background color as well. And I'm using this pink color, which is F1425D. Okay. Then some padding, let's say 40 pixels. Some margin as well, like 30 pixels. A white text color. And a bigger text as well. So font size, let's say 40 pixels as well. Okay. Maybe this is a bit too much, 30. But okay, so now we're good to go. So in this lecture, what I want to do is to focus on the Flexbox properties that we apply on a container. Okay, so basically the first set of properties that I showed you in the last lecture. So the first thing we have to do in order to use Flexbox, remember, is to set the display property to flex. And take a look at what happens immediately. Okay, so these flex items here, they are now automatically side by side, right? Without using any float, without anything, all we did was to set the container to flex, then automatically these child elements become flex items that are displayed side by side. Alright, now the next thing that I want to show you is the property called flex direction. So remember that the default, so the initial value, is the row. So if we say row, nothing changes, right? Because that's the default. But we can also say row reverse. And what happens then is that it inverts the direction of the main axis. So the main axis now goes here from the right side to the left side, where before it was going from the left side to the right side, as I showed you in the diagram in the last lecture, right? And so with this, we inverted the order. And so of course it now starts at 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. All right. Now the next thing that we can try out is the column. And then we get this result. And so now the flex items are stacked one on top of another. So 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, all the way down here. And then the last one is column reverse. And you can imagine what that one will do. Exactly. Now basically the column starts down here, which means that the main direction is going from here down here, up in the direction up here. Okay? So remember, it's always important to know where the main direction goes. Okay? And now that we experimented with all of these, let's just set it back to row, which is the default. So you can probably imagine that this will be pretty handy, for example, for responsive designs. That, for example, on a smaller screen, we can simply set the flex direction to column, and then the elements will all be one on top of another. So that is flex direction. Next up, I want to show you justify content. So justify content. And remember that this property is used to control how the items should be positioned along the main axis, right? So let's start with center here. And so you see that automatically all the items are now right here in the center of the container. So with that very simple property, we immediately centered the entire content in this container. Just imagine how difficult it would be to create this very simple layout that you see here with a float layout. It would be much harder. So center puts these items here right in the middle of the container, but doesn't do anything to the space that's between them, right? Because the space that we have here is defined by the margin that we have on the items, right? So this margin here defines the space. Let's actually try to remove it. Okay, and then it would look like this, right? So all that justify content does is to put all the items in the center of the Flex container, okay? So let me show you another one here, which is space between. And that one is also very exciting. Space between, and that's the result. So what you see now is that the space is evenly distributed between these Flex items. So this space and this, and this, it's all the same space. And Flexbox automatically does all these calculations for us and automatically positions the elements like this. And of course, if we change the width here of the browser, then the space that's between these items also adjusts, right? So that makes it really easy to position and align these elements. Now let me once again get rid of that margin here. Okay, because now that makes it even more visible what the space between property here does. Because there's another one which is actually pretty similar, which is called space around. Space around. So basically what space around does here is that it puts the same amount of space on both the left side and the right side of each of the Flex items. So what this means is that this total space between these two Flex items is double the space that's here on this left side of this item. Alright, now next up there's space evenly, which is also pretty similar to these ones. So space evenly, and as you can see what this one does is that the space is always the same. So this one is the same as this and this and this and all of the spaces here between them. Okay, so while space evenly ensures that the space is always the same between the elements and on the sides of the elements, space around ensures that the amount of space around each element is the same on the left and on the right side, okay? So it's a subtle difference, but it can make a huge difference sometimes. Okay, so space between, space around, and space evenly. I also showed you center already, and so now what we have left is Flex end. So when we want them on the right side, okay? And then Flex start, which is the default. So these are the options for justify content. And I will leave it at center here, okay? And I will also get rid of this margin. Alright, and now the last property I want to show you in this video is align items. So remember that justify content defines how the Flex items are aligned along the main axis, and align items here defines how the items are aligned along the cross axis. Okay? Now in order for this to work, we actually need one of them to be bigger than all the others, because right now they are already perfectly aligned along the cross axis, right? So along this one here. But if I make one of them bigger than the others, then we can experiment with different alignments across the cross axis, right? So let me just put a new class here. So I2 for item 2. And let's give it some height, like 200 pixels or something. And alright, so you saw already that all of them actually growed, not just the I2 on which we defined the height, right? And that's actually because the initial value on align items is stretch. And so with stretch, this is what happens. So let's just set something else here. So for example, center. And now we see what alignment along the cross axis actually means. Okay, so we have one element that is bigger than all the others, and with align items set to center, we basically center these elements here relative to this one, which is bigger, in the vertical direction, so in the cross axis, right? So now along the cross axis, they are now all nicely centered, like around this line here, right? Now if we set this to Flex start, then they will all be aligned here nicely at the top, okay? And the same for Flex end, then they will be aligned here to the end. And all of that happens once again along the cross axis, so in here, from up to down. So we saw center, flex start, flex end, and of course the default is stretch. So what does stretch do? Well, as you see, it simply stretches all the other elements to match the height of the highest flex item, okay? So that can be very useful as well. Now there's actually one more, which is called baseline, and for that I'm going to increase the font size on this one here as well. Or actually I can do it on another one. Let's add one class here called i4. And then in here as well. So font size 70 pixels. Okay, and now if I set this one here to baseline, then what it will do is to basically align the text on these flex items along a line. So if you draw an imaginary line here under these texts, you will see that they are now completely aligned. And if I increase this even more, like say to 90, then they all keep nicely aligned down here along the text, okay? So basically, align items to baseline is to align them to their common text, okay? Now once again, I'm going with center here. And of course, I don't want this font size. Okay, so these were the 3 properties that I wanted to show you in this video here. So flex direction, justify content, and align items. Because these 3 are by far the most used Flexbox properties on the Flex container. Now there are also flex wrap and align content, but I'm gonna leave these for another video. Now, before we finish this one, I wanna show you what happens with the justify content and align items when we change the flex direction. Okay, so let's set this one to a column. All right, and now the main direction is no longer going from the left to the right, but from the top to the bottom, right? And so why are these items now here horizontally centered like this? Do you know why? Well, it's because of this align items property set to center, right? Because this direction here now, so basically the horizontal centering is now in the cross direction. And remember that align items is the property that controls the positioning along the cross axis. And so this center here is responsible for that. So let's set it to flex start. And so now we see that it's at the beginning of the cross axis, which remember now goes from left to right. So it starts here and it ends here. And so if we set it to flex end, then all of these move to the right side, right? And so once again, it's really important to keep track of where the main and the cross axis are situated in order to use the justify content and align items properties in the correct way. Okay, and now just to show you how the justify content works in this situation, let's just increase the height of this container. Okay, to, I don't know, like me experiment here a bit, 500 pixels for example. No, that's not enough. So 1000 pixels even. Or maybe it should be even more, I guess. So 1500 pixels. Okay, and now let's see what happens here. So you see that they now start here, and then they're basically centered now in the container, right? So this space here, down here at the end of the container, is the same as this space here up here, right? And once again, why is that? Well, it's because justify content is set to center. And so along the main axis, which is now going from top to the bottom, right? So along this main axis, they are now centered. So let's change it to space between. And so this is what happens. So the space is now distributed here between these items, just as I showed you before. But when I showed it to you the first time, it was horizontally. So it was in this direction, but now as we change it to a column, it now happens in the vertical direction. Because once again, that is now the main axis. All right. And I think that was enough experimentation for one lecture alone. And I know that it's probably very confusing right now, because I felt the exact same thing when I first started learning Flexbox. It was all very confusing in my head and so many properties with so many different names. But believe me that after some time using these, you will really know how to use them and when to use which property. And it will all become really easy for you, okay? So don't worry if it sounds confusing right now, because with practice, it becomes really easy and intuitive. Okay? And in the next lecture, we're going to take care of the properties related to the flex items themselves. Okay? So we're going to change some order, and experiment with the flex grow, shrink, and flex basis properties. Okay? So keep tuned for that next lecture.